We're gathered tonight to hear Ben speak about the poetry of James Schuyler, the giant of the New York School, of whom his contemporary John Ashbery said, "Schuyler is simply the best we have." Like Lerner, Schuyler was interested in visual art and criticism, serving as an editorial associate for Art News and curator at the Museum of Modern Art. His book, The Morning of the Poem, published in 1980, earned him a Pulitzer Prize. And Schuyler's longtime publisher, Forrest Strauss and Giroux, also Ben's publisher, published his posthumous selected and collected poems, the latter of which we have here for sale this evening. After tonight's lecture, there will be about 15 minutes of audience Q&A, followed by an informal reception and book signing. I hope you will all join me in a round of applause for our speaker this evening, Ben Lerner.
Uh-oh, I've already messed everything up. Hold on. Is this okay? Thank you for having me. Thanks, Parker, for being so generous. And yeah, I'm really happy to get to talk about Schuyler with you guys. I mean, one of the poems I have on repeat in my head is Schuyler's Salute, this little poem Salute, which Parker tells me he's made this printout that has the 3 poems I'm going to talk about tonight. If you want to be able to refer to them as I go, I just might make a little bit more sense because I'm going to try to talk about some small decisions Schuyler made that kind of matter to me. And also you can leave that handout on the train, which is my favorite kind of poetry distribution. It's the only effective kind of poetry distribution that I've encountered. But anyway, some of the people in this room have probably received the poem Salute from me because I send it as an apology when I forget a birthday or to otherwise mark an occasion, or I send it when someone asks me to forgive them for having meant to do something and failed to do it. And it's an appropriate poem to start with because I meant to talk about Schuyler in time for the centenary of his birth, which was in November. And now it's, spring, thank God. And so this is for me, this is a very belated birthday talk or toast for Jimmy Schuyler, which feels appropriate because belatedness is one of his great themes. So let me start by just reading Salute to you. Past is past, and if one remembers what one meant to do and never did, is not to have thought to do enough. Like that gathering of one of each, I plan to gather one of each kind of clover, daisy, paintbrush that grew in that field the cabin stood in, and study them one afternoon before they wilted. Past is past. I salute that various field. Salute, which is not the poem I'm mainly going to discuss, both gathers and separates, does and then undoes what the poem says Schuyler meant to do but never did. And I mean, isn't that the play of assembly and disassembly to a certain extent just what verse is? How part and whole relate or fail to as the poem unfolds in time. That's, to me, a kind of basic drama of poetic form. And Schuyler's enjambments, at once distinct and soft, like the edge of a leaflet or the margin of a petal, are sites of hesitation where meanings collect before they're scattered or revised. So, if you want to look at this poem with me, I don't mean to make you do work. You don't have to look at it, but it might help to look at it. For a second, I hear that like that gather in the 6th line as an imperative, like do it that way. Gather in that manner before the noun gathering gathers across the margin. I briefly hear one of each eye, and each of us is like a field of various eyes, as the object of the gathering before it becomes the subject who has planned it. And the comparative metrical regularity of like that gathering of one of each I planned, the alternating stresses, haunts these enjambments for me. It's a prosodic past or frame the poem salutes and breaks with, breaks up. I'm always slightly surprised when to gather one at the end of the 7th line repeats of each, as opposed to modifying a new specific noun at the left margin of line 8. And this break makes me feel the tension or oscillation between each and kind. and a kind is a gathering of likes between the discrete specimen, each, and the class for which it stands, kind, and the way the particular dissolves into exemplarity when you write it down. And there's so much repetition in this short poem. One appears 5 times, the word one, undoing its singularity. Here it's a person, here it's a number, here it's a specific afternoon. It's as if the vocabulary were being restricted, held constant, so Schuyler can test what relineation might do to the music and meaning, studying each tentative arrangement of the small words he's gathered. So there's this sense of provisionality and casualness and plain speech here and most everywhere in Schuyler, but it coexists for me with the implication of archival formal order. There's the prosodic backdrop I mentioned, but there's also the kind of near syllabic regularity of the lines, like 8 of the 15 are 6 syllables, for instance, or that long U sound that's at the end of the 4th and 12th and 14th line provides some kind of stable sonic architecture. And then there's that crucial repetition of the tautology past is past, a repetition of a repetition that affirms for me that the poem is testing how it might make difference out of sameness, transforming the phrase by delaying the verb across the break where it recurs. So the past returns with a difference. Past is past does not equal past, break is past. So much depends on that non-identity for me, because the latter instance of the phrase, while still melancholy, has a heartbeat. The silence at the break is felt. Past is past. Right? It possesses its own duration. The form happens in the renewable present tense of reading, so that to take a phrase from Jack Spicer, the thing language of the poem overcomes its content, and the line no longer laments time that is simply lost. Like a lot of art for me is in the difference between past is past and past is past. I don't know how to time it, but it's an entirely different world. And I don't mean to make the poem sound triumphant, to imply that time is unequivocally regained, because a salute can be a salutation or, an elegy, as in a funeral salute. And it's the oscillation, I'm going to really run with that word, oscillation, between the modes that lends the poem its tender force. But still, I'm grateful that Schuyler only meant to gather specimens so that the field and all its variety is intact. But I meant to talk, the poem I was going to give a talk about if I had given the talk in November, and now the poem I'm going to talk about tonight is another poem, another flower, called The Bluet, which I think is maybe on the other side of that. This is the one I wanted to talk about in time for his 100th birthday. I'll read this one too, and I don't actually know how to read his poems aloud, which is another kind of conversation. But anyway, here's the Bluet, a poem I love. And is it stamina that unseasonably freaks forth a bluet, a Quaker lady by the lake, so small a drop of sky that splashed and held, 4-petaled, creamy in its throat? The woods around were brown, the air crisp as a car's table water biscuit and smelt of cider. There were frost apples on the trees in the field below the house. The pond was still, then broke into a ripple. The hills, the leaves that have not yet fallen, are deep in oriental rug colors. Brown leaves in the woods set off gray trunks of trees. But that bluet was the focus of it all. Last spring, next spring, what does it matter? Unexpected as a tear when someone reads a poem you wrote for him. It's this line here. That bluet breaks me up, tiny spring flower, late, late, in dour October. That's good, right? That's a good poem. Instead of beginning with the past, as in Salute, here we start with and in medias res, evoking the epic the poem obviously isn't, although the question of stamina, of effort, and its prolongation seem consonant with the generic marker, and from the perspective of something so small, unseasonably pushing through the soil is pretty epic. It's remarkable to me how much erotic or at least potentially erotic language the poem begins with, but without sex overwhelming the lexical field. I dare you to put the following terms in a Google search: stamina, freaks, splashed, creamy, throat. All this makes the Quaker lady sound a little like a freak, maybe in drag, but then such a reading is cut by the proximity of lady to lake, which makes it literary, idealizing, Arthurian, the lady of the lake. So there is oscillation between scales, including of genre, and between the carnal and the courtly. And then stamina is also a plural of stamen, if not the most common plural, which is the pollen-producing male reproductive organ of the Quaker lady of the lake in question, right? So the grammar of the line keeps the botanical sexual sense from being the primary one, but it's there, and it's queer, and the words themselves waver between being plain and literary, thingly and elusive, while the diction is at once talky and taut, a little heightened. And I love that held at the end of the seventh line, like how held just manages to hold the splash of sky before it spills over the precipice of the right margin. Like you can almost see it tremble with the effort, buttressed by the comma, and all three of the words in the line end in D, and all the letters of the word held are held by splashed, as if they splashed out of the longer word, and pedaled in the subsequent line seems, at least to me, to synthesize the sounds of splashed and held, and that's a very beautiful definition of a pedal, a splash of color that held, that holds until it withers. And the L sounds of pedaled will later be held still and still after they rest in the word apple and then break into a ripple, and then they continue to ripple through the poem, like you can hear them pool in the word oriental. And there are other sonic relays in the poem. The paintbrush, that important kind of flower in Salute, is so called because it is said to resemble brushes dipped in bright red or orange-yellow paint. And I think the bluet in this poem is both an actual blue flower in the world, right, like something Schuyler is looking at, and invariably the blue flower of art, the blaue Blume of Novalis, right, the famous figure of romantic, poetic possibility. So there's another crucial oscillation here between nature and culture, between a particular blossom and a poetic symbol. And Schuyler himself would be dismissive, I think, of the Novalis blue flower reading. Like he has this line at the beginning of Letter to a Friend, who is Nancy Dom, that says, all things are real, no one a symbol. And in an interview, Schuyler said, I'm not interested in the idea of the rose as it occurs on and on throughout literature. I'm interested in roses and George Arends and a new rose. But even in these very Williams-like disavowals of the flower as a symbol, there's this blurry boundary between nature and convention. Like he's interested in the new rose that's brought into existence via the horticulturalist's art. The flower is named for its author, George Arends. It's ornamental. And what could be more literary than to be fascinated by the name of the rose, right? Obsessed as Schuyler was by the nomenclature of flowers. He has this poem, Horse Chestnut Trees and Roses, that's just really a celebration of the names of cultivars more than the flowers. So while the flower is never merely a symbol in Schuyler, it could be said to symbolize the meeting of nature and culture, of the given and the made, of the discrete things and the kinds that language makes. So maybe it's more to the point to say that Schuyler's description of the flower transforms it into art, and that this kind of transformation is his signature poetic activity. It happens again and again in his poems. He describes what he sees before him as if it were a painting, so that observation of the natural world becomes ekphrasis, starts to seem like writing about art. And that's why if you skip down a little in the bluet, right, the leaves are likened to a rug, crossing outside and inside, nature and culture. And those leaves set off the gray the way a painter or sharp dresser uses one color to set off or complement another. Why the air is like a made thing too, if one you eat, and why the bluet is called the focus, the way art critics say something is the focus of the composition. Schuyler's words are paintbrushes. What he describes becomes a painting, though he treats it as already painted. Paint, which is another medium that splashes and then holds. And these are examples, there are examples of this everywhere in his books, right? Like in Evenings in Vermont, a rug again mediates between inside and outside art and nature. He says, I study the pattern in a red rug, arabesques and squares, and one red streak lies in the west over the ridge. And the poem Scarlet Tanager, how do you say, is it Tanager? When you give a talk, you realize you don't know how to pronounce any of the words you use. It's the bird, the scarlet, I don't know, it doesn't matter. And the scarlet tanager, the bird in the tree provides, the red touch green cries out for. In a gray thought, another Schuyler poem, a dark, thick green is laid in layers on the spruce, and so on. What I'm trying to draw your attention to is the touches and the layerings, the way color is described as paint and natural phenomena are perceived as art. Because I actually think this is like a really important, if mild, thing that Schuyler does, that it re-enchants the world barely, briefly, by converting what's merely there into significant form so that the landscape becomes a history of small artistic decisions. Like whose decisions, whose touches and layerings, not God's, and not quite like Wallace Stevens's major man reinvesting the world with meaning through the powers of poetic imagination, but not that either. It's more like a minor man who has looked at a lot of good paintings and also looked in a lot of pain out of the window, another frame of Payne Whitney, which was the mental hospital where Schuyler spent some time. The poem Salute was written in Bloomingdale Hospital in White Plains. So like Williams said, no ideas but in things. Stevens said that poetry's power is the power of the mind over things, and I think Schuyler oscillates between them. Like Schuyler's closer to Williams in the attention to mundane speech and the mundane things at hand, like a car's cracker. He's crucially close to Williams in enjambment as the foundational poetic technique, like in Spring and All, where Williams says that so to engage roses becomes a geometry. But Schuyler is a little bit more like Stevens in the project of imaginative redescription, bluet, blue flower, blue guitar. The literary genealogy doesn't really matter. I mean, and one could configure it differently, but my point is that the magic of Schuyler is that you feel nature becoming art as you read, or you feel the effort to make it so, its fluctuations, and often its failure. Now, of course, he's not describing an actual painted image, right? But he's making a poetic one. Schuyler is composing the scene. The small decisions are his. But it feels like he's engaging another medium. And so the poet's act of creation is kind of smuggled in, as if he were just looking at somebody else's representation of the view. And this gives his voice a kind of secondariness, a kind of modesty. I'm not the visionary. I'm just reviewing the visionary for Art News, where he was an associate editor. That's like my sense of the tone. And that this in part accounts for how his tone, and it's very hard to describe this tone, is simultaneously matter of fact and metamorphic. Because Schuyler makes his writing seem like he's reading a painting that already exists. But this kind of secondariness actually becomes a species of immediacy because that ekphrastic language also describes his own verbal form, the poem we're reading, right? The splashes and holds of the bluet, the falls from margin to margin. And this means that Schuyler's reading and our reading of Schuyler correspond. Our acts of attention are calibrated across time. And I assume it's obvious that I'm not at all saying like Schuyler's the only poet who makes the world seem like a made thing, like art, or that he's the only poet whose unfolding perceptions are transferred to poetic form so that as we attend to his work, author and reader are in a sense coeval. On the contrary, like some version of such transformations and transfers are present in the writing I love across genres and eras, but that's why I wanted to use the occasion to try to describe and celebrate Schuyler's specific quiet style, his techniques and tonality, because they really do touch something fundamental in the art for me. And here, I might mention that while they're very different writers, Schuyler's tendency to reframe nature as art is a characteristic shared with his friend, the brilliant and perennially underread Barbara Guest. And while Schuyler's talkiness and dailiness have more in common with Frank O'Hara, who couldn't, as O'Hara wrote in Meditations in an Emergency, even enjoy a blade of grass unless he knew there's a subway handy or a record store or some other sign that people do not totally regret life, Schuyler is in many ways closer to Guest in his tendency to redescribe nature as culture, to present the merely contingent as arranged. And as with Schuyler, this transformation in Guest often involves a window, a frame in which natural phenomena might appear as the touches or layerings of the compositional. Art and windows are often paired in Guest, as in her great poem, The View from Kandinsky's Window, or the title of her collected writings on art, Juror in the Window. I mean, somebody should write an essay, maybe somebody has written an essay on windows in the New York School. The windows of the New York School would probably sound better. I think of Ashbery's, he has this poem, October at the Window. He has the poem, The New Hire, that has these lines, the window where the outside crept away. And there's Frank O'Hara's small poem, Windows, this space so clear and blue does not care what we put into it. And one way Schuyler has a significant aesthetic affiliation with these other writers, as opposed to just a social one, is in his experiments with what one can put into the window. And it's put into, because the frame of the window for them stands for the transformation of contingency into composition. Like for his part, Schuyler is really clear and modest, like sometimes to the point of quiet comedy, about the centrality of windows in his composition. So like people interview him and they get answers like this. They say, how do you write your poems? And he says, there are things all through the poem that are actually what I'm seeing out the window in Southampton, or the things described in it are what I was seeing out the window in the house in Maine, and so on. But you know what I'm saying? Like the window is a frame in which relations between what just happens to be there can start to be treated as if they were like compositional decisions. But that was like you could set all that aside. But to return to lateness and its undoing, past is past, late. Belatedness is the traditional theme that Salute and the Bluet indulge and, in their small way, defeat or better, gently suspend. The Bluet can be assigned to the last spring or the next one. That doesn't matter since it's happening now, unexpected as a tear that we're not entirely sure isn't a tear, like a torn or jagged right margin of a poem, until it's tuned, made decisively lacrimal by the here arriving at the left margin in the third to last line. Do you know what I'm saying? Like you don't know for sure if it's tear or tear. And so then that part of the past of the poem you have to revise when you get to here. So it's another way that the past isn't past, or that, in the poem, operating on the plane of sound. And like all rhyme does that to a certain extent. He's just really good at it. Tear itself remains suspended between being a drop, which recalls the drop of sky the flower holds, or something rent, something torn so as to leave ragged or irregular edges, until it drops over the irregular edge of the poem. It's this line here. That's my favorite moment in all of Schuyler. It's this line break here, except it isn't. I mean, it is my favorite line, but it isn't this line here, or it is and it isn't, because this refers, at least as first, to the fourth to last line, right? The here begins the third to last. The line about the line that caused the tear is torn across the margin. It's in both places at once, or it's in neither place, a Schrodinger's cat of a line. Last line, next line, what does it matter? One way it matters is that the formal irony, the way the line break renders this and here paradoxical, undecidable, means that these deictics, these words that depend on their context, seem ultimately to refer to the unnameable break itself, that little moment of hesitation that we use of virgule or a slash to denote in prose, a felt silence, the white space that is the drop of sky or teardrop no longer held or contained within the terms of the poem. Emotion is instead expressed by formal motion. Past is past. It's this line here. All of poetry is for me in those little delays, catches in the breath, delays that both formally enact belatedness and, by making it felt in the embodied present tense of reading, undo it. In both instances, past as a cliche. It's this line here as quoted speech from a friend or lover. Schuyler is breaking up received phrases, right? Found language, showing how lineation, how art can alter the given, how how secondariness isn't just lateness, but an opportunity for imaginative transformation. The person Schuyler quotes has to point to the line that moves him. It escapes description or paraphrase. And I think of the hymn, whatever the biographical facts, as a lover because of the erotic language earlier in the poem where the drops of sky might be sexual fluid. It's a wonderful feedback loop of reading and writing, or a Mobius strip in which the two become a single practice. Schuyler writes the poem that moves the lover. Schuyler is moved that the lover is moved. The lover's language about being moved, indicating a line we never see, is then so movingly arranged, broken up in a second poem that breaks me up each time I read it. So mere belatedness is replaced with a chain of feeling to which we readers can add links. And another poet would sound self-aggrandizing. Look how my poems move men to tears. But what I hear is Schuyler's melancholy gratitude, admiration for that openness, receptivity, capacity to be affected, which his poem communicates, makes available in the slash here of poetry. And that slash here, that here that comes after a break, is what I hear described in other poems of Schuyler's, like this poem he wrote, a thank you note to Kenward Elmsley for the gift of a letter opener. It's a poem called A Stone Knife, a poem that recalls salute and that both celebrates and enacts the renewable surprise of poetic form. I'll just read you 6 lines of it, but you can hear all this stuff in play. The surprise is that the surprise, once past, is always there, which to enjoy is not to consume. The unrecapturable returns. So there are, of course, a range of forms and moods and modes in Schuyler: long poems, poems with very long lines, poems that incorporate a lot of white space, not to mention the novels, which are pretty great. But my Schuyler will always be the miniaturist of Salute or the Bluet, or great poems like Korean Mums and Other Flowers. Other Flowers is also the name of his uncollected poems that FSG published. But in these poems in particular, Schuyler possesses a kind of soft Midas touch in which everything his eye alights on becomes art, becomes composition as he describes it. And then his own compositional decisions, especially his enjambments, his unexpected tears, rhymes with stairs, bring our attention in line with his so that we feel we are looking together across time. So the past is not merely past, but always present in the form, available as the present of form, which is never consumed. But again, the thing about Schuyler is, like, I'm making him sound a little too triumphant, like the poems solve the problems, as if losses were ultimately overcome. But I say it's a Midas touch because often in Schuyler, the poem, the art, is a document of emotional suffering and isolation. The drama of part and whole that I was saying is so central to poetry is also a drama in Schuyler of, like, holding it together. You know, the thread of falling apart is emotional and not just technical in the poems. You know, I've always been struck by that injunction, that, like, terrible, profound injunction, compose yourself before you go out on stage or, like, go face your mother or your child or whatever it is, compose yourself. Like, Schuyler is, like, literally struggling with the effort to compose himself, and mental illness as a threat of disorganization is constant in the work. And sometimes the lines really tremble with the effort. Like, sometimes the desire to bring the outside inside, to press nature into art, has a quiet desperation, as in the last lines of the last poem I'll quote in its entirety, which is this little poem, February 13th, 1975, which is also on that sheet, which is, sometimes people call them the Payne Whitney poems, but they're all poems he wrote while he was in the hospital. This is February 13th, 1975. Tomorrow is St. Valentine's. Tomorrow I'll think about that. Always nervous, even after a good sleep I'd like to climb back into. The sun shines on yesterday's new fallen snow, and yester-even it turned the world to pink and rose and steel blue buildings. Helene is restless, leaving soon. And what then will I do with myself? Someone is watching morning TV. I'm not reduced to that yet. I wish one could press snowflakes in a book like Flowers. So so many of the oscillations I've described are happening softly here. And like I'm choosing this poem in part because they are really soft. There are other poems in which I think they're really, really clear. But I just want to kind of show you the way I read a poem like this, or what makes the feeling intense for me if also quiet. Like, I think you can read the first line as talky. It certainly asks to be talky, but you can also read it as iambic tetrameter, like evoking a traditional prosody that the poem then breaks up. And there's the plain speech and ghosts of made phrases, the ghosts of cliche. Nothing new under the sun is almost in the poem. Yesterday's news is almost in the poem, in the sixth line. But then it coexists with the archaic literariness of yester even, right, which is definitely only a word I've seen written in the relative past. This casualness, the talkiness, is also cut, again, by sonic patterning, sonic relays into, new, blue, soon, do, reduced, that help hold the form together. The world becomes a made thing when the sun turns it into steel blue buildings. All the space becomes built, and even the small surprise of TV at the left margin of the third to last line, where morning reveals itself to be an adjective and not the object of someone's watching, is another instance of nature becoming culture. And then we have, and this is the stuff that breaks my heart. Then we have the temporal tensions, the little glitches across the margins, as in yesterday's new fallen snow. What was new yesterday is already old. The new fallen is just the most recently belated, especially if you make the new pause for a moment before it falls across the margin. The poem, like every poem, is late and early, like a spring flower in October, as it is written in lonely anticipation of tomorrow, Valentine's Day, and all this leads to the fantasy of art existing outside of time, of yet being stilled, of being pressed, a significant near rhyme between yet and pressed, the snow preserved between the pages like a flower one planned to gather, and is not to have thought to do enough, as he would say. Thank you very much.